This is episode 19 of Ye Olde Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Right, it's time for another episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. This is episode number 19. Boy, we're just coming right along here. We appreciate all the listeners and all the support that you've given us. This has been a lot of fun, and we're going to continue journeying on with more episodes. We've got so much content that we want to explore, so many features, so many reviews. It's literally never ending. So, Tom, what do we have today?
Okay, so today we're going to do a feature on hard-boiled censorship. We're going to talk about how in the past some of these books that we like so much have had censorship happen to them. And I'll leave it at that now because we'll be talking about it soon enough. We have 2 reviews scheduled today. Eric's going to review Bloody Jungle by Charles Runyon. And I'm going to review Modesty Blaze #1 by Peter O'Donnell. Now, usually this is the point of the podcast where we talk about where we've been and some shopping that we've been doing. However, neither of us have been anywhere. Let's do a quick pop quiz. Quick, what are you reading right now, Eric?
That was spontaneous. Okay, I'm reading... all right, so I've got the third book of Wasteworld. It's a post-apocalyptic series that came out in the early 80s. In fact, this one is 1984. And it was written by either Angus Wells or Lawrence James. I think Justin Marriott and I go back and forth on who actually wrote this thing, but I think there's enough evidence out there that says Angus Wells was writing this. But it's post-apocalyptic. It's about a guy who's journeying from New Orleans over to Salt Lake City, Utah to be with his family, and he's going through waves of mutants and bandits and all kinds of psychotic stuff. This one's actually very similar to the Phoenix series, this particular book, although it's much, much better than David Alexander, who's a talentless hack, in my opinion. This is great stuff. I didn't like the first Wasteworld that much, but the second one really impressed me, and this one is just as equally good. So that's me. What do you got?
Okay, so I just started, I'm only on page 6, so I don't have a full review for you, of Murder in Room 13 by Albert Conroy, a Fawcett Gold Medal book from 1958. Albert Conroy is author Marvin Albert, who I've enjoyed. I reviewed another Albert Conroy book called The Devil in Dungarees on the site that I really enjoyed. And the plot of this one is a basic plot, but I know it's going to be good because he wrote it. It's one of those ones where a guy gets with a girl and has sex with her, and then either wakes up or soon thereafter he finds that she's dead in the hotel room, and the cops think it's him, and he's got to solve the mystery himself. It's a plot that's been done 1,000 times, but I'm only reading it because I really like this Marvin Albert guy, and his Albert Conroy books are pretty good. So that's what I'm reading now.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess so.
Should we launch right into it? I guess this may be a bit of a long one as far as the feature. I'm talking about censorship. We're calling it hard-boiled censorship. And I want to present 3 different case studies of censorship in the genres that we talk about here and review on the site. First one, let's talk about the Hank Jansen series. So the books we enjoy from the 20th century, hard-boiled crime, western, men's adventure, have lots of sex and violence, right? They're marketed to men. There have been movements of governments cracking down on obscene content in men's genre literature. The Hank Jansen series is a pretty famous example of that. The series is mostly written by a guy named Stephen Francis as Hank Jansen, and they were racy books at the time. They had very sexy painted covers, but nothing graphic. By today's standards, there's just nothing to them as far as the sex in them. Hank Jansen was actually the most popular and successful British pulp fiction authors of the 1940s and 50s. His books were violent, pseudo-American thrillers sold in paperback editions featuring erotic cover art. Sometimes Hank Jansen was the main character, sometimes it was just the byline. For 10 years, Stephen Francis cranked out Hank Jansen books every month. There's about 300 of them in total, and he sold about 13 million of them. Stephen Francis also wrote the John Gale series? John Gall is Atlee. John Gale is Stephen Francis. Does that sound right?
I was always confused on those.
Whatever. In the 1960s and 70s, I really loved that series. There's a guy named Steve Holland who wrote a nonfiction book called The Trials of Hank Jansen about the problems this guy had. What happened is several of the Hank Jansen novels were banned in the Republic of Ireland by the government there. And they had examples in England and Ireland of police raiding bookshops, seizing his novels and destroying them. Booksellers in Europe were actually criminally prosecuted for selling books in this popular series. The publisher and the distributor were fined. People were sent to jail for 6 months. Stephen Francis, while he was writing these books, moves to Spain. The police catch up to him in Spain for having written these things and violating European obscenity laws. He denied that he was the author of the books, and he was charged with the crime of writing these books, but he beat the rap because they couldn't prove that he wrote the books. Stephen Francis later said that he didn't write the books, he dictated them, and someone else wrote them. So that was his little technicality. In 1954, an author named D.F. Crawley was prosecuted, only to be acquitted when it was discovered that he no longer had the rights to the Jansen pseudonym as a publisher. So again, I don't know a ton about this story other than what I've read in articles that are summarizing this book, The Trials of Hank Jansen by Steve Holland. But it's just an example of, and what's interesting is that every one of these books by definition has a grisly murder that's happening, but the violence in these books never seems to upset anybody. It's just the sex in these books and the idea that they have sexual content, which is crazy, because if you think about it, what's a worse thing for society, sex or violence? It's clearly violence. So I want to move on to another quick example. Example number 2 is the Detective Book Club. What the Detective Book Club, you see these all the time if you go to a lot of used bookstores, and I have a bunch of them. They were basically republished paperback crime novels as triples in hardcover, where they would have issue 3 books in one volume. It was a subscription model. I think it began in 1942 and continued into the 1990s. It was a monthly deal you could subscribe to, like the Columbia Record and Tape Club, where they would just send them to you. And a lot of big authors had their books republished as Detective Book Club books. Wade Miller, Donald Westlake, Amber Dean, John D. MacDonald, A.A. Fair. I mean, good quality authors. And these books were a good value, and I think still are to an extent, is they were $1.89 per book in the 1950s. And again, you get 3 novels for that. In 1971, they were $3.39 per book. One thing to understand, though, is that these books weren't abridged like Reader's Digest were, but the sex scenes were removed from the books if they were too racy. And so, if you want to read the book as the author intended it to be read, you probably want to skip the Detective Book Club books. And this was something that, for some reason, the book club, because they were advertising in probably Ladies' Home Journal and other places, wanted to remove the sex scenes, but they didn't remove any of the murder scenes. I actually have 2 more examples. Third is a more serious one, is the Harlequin reissues. And David Rachel's a professor in a South Carolina college that I can't recall the name of right now. He wrote about this in noirboiled.blogspot.com, a great article, called The Harlequin Bowdlerizations. Bowdlerization is when you change the content or take out content from an existing work. I believe it was named after John Bowdler, who had a bunch of hit books in the 1818 era, where he was basically reprinting William Shakespeare books with all the bad stuff taken out of them. Anyway, so in October 2009, Harlequin was celebrating some anniversary in their printing history by reprinting 6 classic titles from the 1950s with original artwork. And so I see these sometimes in used bookstores, these Harlequin reissues from 2009, and they're beautiful. Most of them look like they were romance books, but a couple of them were by an author that I enjoy, and I know you enjoy, named James Hadley Chase. One was called I'll Bury My Dead, and the other was called You Never Know with Women. And so I bought these because I thought they were really cool. But we later find out is that Harlequin in 2009 censored these books. What they did is they took social behavior that was okay, that wasn't okay, but it was depicted in these books from the 1940s and 50s, like hitting a woman, and removed those scenes from the books in 2009. There was a scene of near rape that James Hadley Chase wrote about that was also removed from the books. The grammar and spelling was corrected for modern audiences, and I don't get too bent out of shape about that. But this guy, David Rachel's, who's this academic who covers pulp fiction, he's kind of the leading foremost expert on Gil Brewer, he took the time to actually compare the manuscripts of Bury My Dead, the 2009 reissue, with the original text. And he found a bunch of example after example of censorship. At one point, a character uses the term, I'm not going to say the N-word, but N-word dash brown shoes to describe someone's shoes. And that was censored, obviously. They took out the N-word for the 2009 edition. At some point, a character is referring to an African-American female as being a dark, cheap bitch of a girl. And for the 2009 version, they took out the fact that she was dark and cheap and just said she was a bitch of a girl. At one point, a character says, "Hit you? The only woman I've ever hit is my wife." In the 2009 version, Harlequin made that, "Hit you? Never." And so, I don't know. David Rachels was incensed by this. I'm kind of incensed by this. I mean, why on earth would you take the time to remove stuff in a 2009 edition when you're clearly reprinting a book and celebrating your history as a publisher? It makes no sense to me. The last example I want to talk about is one that was personal to me that I discovered that I've never seen documented anywhere except for an article I wrote. So let me pull back the curtain a little bit in Paperback Warrior. In order to keep up with Eric's demanding production schedule that he makes me do, I sometimes turn to audiobooks as a mean to, because I'd spend a lot of time driving, to basically get Pulp Fiction into my skull through my ears instead of my eyes. And so I was happy to find that the Golden Hawk adult Western series by Will C. Knott, that's Knott, was available as audio. And I like adult Westerns, like we talked about a few weeks ago, so I thought I'd give it a listen. And so there were 9 installments in the Golden Hawk series between 1986 and 1988. Now, I didn't think it was going to be great because I wasn't really fond of Knott's work. He wrote some books in the Long Arm series, and I didn't think they were very good books or that he was a very good writer. He also contributed installments to the Trailsman series and the Slocum series that I haven't read. But I thought, well, he's got a series of his own with Golden Hawk. Let's see if it's any good. And so, it's a family that runs into a bunch of bloodthirsty Comanches who torture and murder the parents, they kidnap the kids. And then halfway through the audiobook, I realized, well, this is an adult Western series. There's something missing. There's supposed to be graphic sex scenes in adult Western books that periodically occur, and I don't see that as a bad thing. And the audiobook had plenty of willing women that the main character, Jed, encounters, but all the scenes awkwardly and without any sex kind of fade to black before anybody gets naked. And so I thought, oh my goodness. I was literally driving in my car and thinking, I wonder if they censored this book. And so I pulled over into a bookstore that we've talked about called the Family Bookshop in DeLand. I went to the section there and I literally pulled out a paperback of the first edition of this, of Golden Hawk #1, and began taking a look at the scenes which I had just listened to 10, 15 minutes earlier. And sure enough, there were graphic sex scenes in that. And it was actually important part of the plot to show the difference between what Jed will do with willing women and the Comanches who are just raping women left and right in the books. And so I realized that I was just totally ripped off by this audiobook. And so the audio production company that made this was a company called Books in Motion of Spokane, Washington. They clumsily edited out all the sex scenes. And, Eric, can I swear on this podcast?
There's a little box that I have to check that says this isn't explicit. Even though we talk about castrating a lot, you can't curse.
Please? Okay, I'm going to... I wish I could swear because I'm so furious at this company, Books in Motion of Spokane. Those a-holes... they listed the audiobook when they're selling it as being unabridged, right? So you're buying this book, and in my mind, unabridged means unabridged. You're not editing it out or taking out sections. I can only assume, at first I thought I could only assume this was done at the direction of Will C. Knott or his estate. The author died in 2008. But again, then I began looking into it a little more, and I was just so furious. I ended up finishing the novel, but it was terrible way to read a book. So I sent an email to Books in Motion just seeking comment for an article that I wrote about this phenomenon at Paperback Warrior, and basically calling them on the fact that they're misleading claims. They're committing fraud by saying this audiobook is unabridged, and they declined comment for my article, and they never got back to me. Anyway, you can pass on this one. It's a terrible book, whether it has sex scenes in it or not. Your money's better spent elsewhere. When I posted about this on Facebook, ranting and raving, like I'm the only one who seemed to care about this, someone pointed me to an article in the Spokesman Review where Books in Motion owner Gary Challender, if you're looking for a villain in the story, he's the villain. He said that their first audiobook that they ever produced was Executioner #1, War Against the Mafia. And the journalist said, well, are there things you won't publish? And Gary Challender, and I won't swear, said this, well, X-rated books for one. Our books are mostly G-rated, and we're finding that customers don't want the profanity. So we might just change the F word to frigging or something like that if it doesn't ruin the story. Then the journalist said, well, how do the authors react? And he goes, oh, they go along with it. Some even edit out the profanity for us. Again, if you people want to read a book that changes the F word to friggin' or takes out all the sex scenes in a Western sex book, be my guest. My biggest problem is the false advertising of selling this novel as being unabridged when it's not. I'm generally against censorship in all forms, especially when it comes to books. And I also think it's crazy that everyone freaks out over about the sex, but not the violence in these books. Trust me, the Comanches doing these awful things to people wasn't taken out. Anyway, what are your thoughts, Eric?
Hey, real fast, you mentioned Executioner #1. Fans of the Executioner might remember that Pinnacle wanted Don Pendleton to add sex scenes into the Executioner, the first Executioner book. So War Against the Mafia has, I believe, at least 2 sex scenes in it, which is unlike any other Executioner novel. Did they censor that out too, I'm assuming?
I have no idea. Again, this was the first book they ever produced. So they might have towed the line back then. And trust me, I'm not throwing another penny at Books in Motion of Spokane, Washington. I hope they go out of business. But I was wondering the same thing when I read. I could not believe that they took. Why are they bothering to produce books that they find objectionable? There's a million books out there in the universe that they could produce into audiobooks and get the rights to for that. But instead, they're going out and seeking out books with sex and violence and profanity, and so they can edit that stuff out. It's obscene.
Okay. Do you want me to defend this?
Yeah.
Okay. So I this is a little bit personal on my side, but I went through a divorce last year, and when you go through a divorce, you either go out and get laid a lot, you become an alcoholic, or you become a Christian. So I started going to church. I joined church last year, and it's kind of hard to go to church and then still read this kind of fiction. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes. And then, as I'm trying to grow in my faith and start, living a more godly lifestyle, I can sort of see, like, maybe I do want to read this, what was it called? Golden
Hawk.
Maybe I want to read Golden Hawk, but I do this now. If I'm reading a book and it has a sex scene, I just flip past it. I do that.
All right. Well, okay. Then fine. Then let's suppose that there is a market for people who want to read the Dr. Seuss version of adult novels. Let's not make it. Let's not list it as unabridged. Can we at least agree that you ought not to put these things in the Trojan horse of an unabridged book if you're going to edit out the scenes and actually abridge the book for the things that you find offensive?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that, and I mean, it's a weird thing, but I'm not the holiest of all holy people, but in terms of trying to be a Christian, we probably, general consensus is we probably don't read this fiction anyway. I think Louis L'Amour and William Johnson are probably the safe picks, maybe Zane Grey, and a lot of Christians. My dad's a devout Christian, and that's his favorite authors. You probably want to stick to that stuff instead of adult westerns to begin with.
Yeah, okay, fine, fair enough. I mean, again, I have no problem with Spokane, Washington publishing books for the Christian market.
It's the lie.
It's the lie, yeah. And there's plenty of books they could be publishing.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Why on earth are they the ones seeking out an adult Western to publish just so they can take out all the stuff that makes it an adult Western?
It's a lie.
Yeah. All right. So anyways, that's my soapbox. And so if you have thoughts on censorship in genre fiction, I'd love for you to tell me what your thoughts are. You can check it out on our Facebook page in the comments underneath this podcast. You got a review to do.
Yeah, and I would say that was fascinating. You mentioned that was going to be your feature this week, and I didn't know where you were going with that. So that was good.
All
right. So my review. I'm going hoarse. I've been talking all day. I apologize. All right. So I've got Bloody Jungle by Charles Runyon. I read one of his books last year, and I really enjoyed it. And I think it was Color Me Dead or Color Him Dead, which was fantastic. Bloody Jungle was released in 1965 by Ace, and it was the 5th published novel by the author. He wrote a handful of crime noir novels, with the most recognized one being 1965's The Prettiest Girl I Ever Killed. And Tom, you read that, didn't you?
I did. I enjoyed the writing. I thought he's a very good and talented writer. And I just didn't enjoy the voice he chose to write it in. It's a first-person novel by told by a serial killer who's very kind of cavalier about his serial killing, and it was disturbing without being the good kind of disturbing. So I ended up bailing on it. I can't give it a review much of either way because I don't think I made it much past chapter 4 or 5.
Fair enough. And I think a lot of his work, his early work, has been reprinted by Prologue Crime and maybe even Stark House. I can't remember, but there's reprints out there. But like his contemporary in Harry Whittington, Charles Runyon authored one novel within the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Whittington's was Doomsday Mission, and Runyon's is, of course, Bloody Jungle. It stars Lieutenant Clay Macklin, who's an American Green Beret fighting near the Cambodian border. He's on a military base that's protecting this village of 2,500. And the novel, it starts out with Macklin and his demolition sergeant finding this North Vietnamese defector who's crawling around the outer perimeter of their base. And he warns Macklin that a large battalion of North Vietnamese have regrouped and are planning to attack the base the next night. The problem is that Macklin's defense is really slim. On this base, there's only 34, 35 guys manning the whole base. So, needless to say, it's going to be a slaughter. Without spoiling too much, because I don't want to ruin this for you, because it's a great book, there's a clever plot twist that places Macklin and some select riflemen outside of the base as it's overcome with MVA forces. With most of his soldiers dead, he drags one of his wounded men, for miles until they reach the small village. It's here that he meets a young woman and her baby, and Runyon really propels the narrative at this point. He puts in a little bit of romance, but his primary focus is Macklin learning about the MVA attacks and how some of the intelligence reports that the base had received was possibly suggesting that there was a betrayal somewhere along the way. It's 160 pages, so it's a fairly short book, and it's saturated with jungle battles. It's got some torture sequences in it, which is really kind of surprising considering the era. It's got some detective work, which was surprising as well, in downtown Saigon. I thought that part was really neat. To have the action in the jungle, but to let the readers escape just for a minute into a more urban area was good on the author's part. Bloody Jungle, the action is nearly nonstop. It's extremely violent. I don't know. It's really well worth the price of admission. I did a quick look before I did this review, which I think is going to be out on paperbackwarrior.com a little later. But I did a quick peek at 8 books, and it suggests that you should be able to get an original copy of this paperback for about $10 to $15, including shipping. I think it's worth it. It's got a great cover, by the way. I know we're not supposed to judge it by its cover, but it's got a fantastic cover. But anyway, I highly recommend it. It's Bloody Jungle by Charles Runyon. Pick that one up.
That sounds good. I want to explore more Charles Runyon. Just because I didn't enjoy The Prettiest Girl I Ever Killed, I think I've heard so many good things about that guy. I want to delve deeper into his catalog.
Yeah, and I want to try Anatomy of Murder, which I think was his first. And his second book is actually, it looks like it's a chopper book, a motorcycle book.
Really?
Yeah, so it looks really cool.
That's fun. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. I want to review Modesty Blaze, number 1 by Peter O'Donnell. I think the title was just Modesty Blaze. I had always misjudged Modesty Blaze. I always kind of lumped it into my mind with this slew of moronic female James Bond parody novels like The Baroness or Cherry Delight, Agent of Nympho. But then I was talking to online or saw a post from Randall from Spy Guys and Gals, this fascinating website that covers series novels in the espionage genre. It's not really a blog; it's almost like Wikipedia for those type of books, but with capsule reviews of the entire series. And he says Modesty Blaze is his favorite series of all time, and I really respect that guy. And if he says something's good, it's good. So I gave it a shot. A little bit of background: the character of Modesty Blaze was originally conceived as a comic strip in 1963 by a British writer named Peter O'Donnell. The success of the strip landed Peter O'Donnell a film deal, and he wrote an early draft of a screenplay starring his sexy female spy named Modesty Blaze for a movie that was eventually released in 1966. And a year before the movie's release, O'Donnell adapts his unproduced screenplay into the first of 11 Modesty Blaze paperback novels in the series. They ended up making the movie, but they changed so much of it, it doesn't even resemble the screenplay that he wrote or the novel that's book number 1 in the series. The first book in this Modesty Blaze series is a true origin story of the character who's a female gang leader turned spy. The idea is that Modesty grew up an orphan in a Baltic refugee camp and worked her way into the position of a wealthy, international organized crime leader before she retired and gave it all up and she retires to Great Britain at age 26. Which is where the novel picks up. She has this unusual skill set that she gained from running this giant clandestine network of criminals that came to the attention of the British SIS, who wants to recruit her as an operative. She has a sidekick by the name of Willie Garvin, and when the book opens, Willie Garvin is in prison, and the SIS gives Modesty Blaze permission and kind of the tools she needs to orchestrate a prison break so she can get Willie Garvin out. And so there's a bit of Free Willy going on in this without the whale. The Modesty character herself, again, it's not cartoonish at all. She's a real badass. I would compare her character to what Scarlett Johansson's version of the Black Widow was from the Marvel movies. Anyway, once reunited, Modesty and Willie both share with each other that they're just bored as hell with retired life and they want to get back into the action. This is coinciding with the Brits wanting her to work as an operative for them. And so the novel shifts to the actual assignment, which involves a massive shipment of diamonds to a Middle Eastern sheik, and there's fear that the diamonds are going to get hijacked, and Modesty gets involved with that. It was clear that O'Donnell had a real vision for this character that went beyond being just a TNA spy lampoon, and his writing is just excellent. Modesty's definitely a sexy operative, but this debut adventure of hers is never cartoonish. It's never stupid. It's never pandering. And I don't really want to spoil much else, except to tell you that it's really well drawn and it's violent in the right places. This debut does really everything right, and I'm excited to read the next installment. I've only read this first book, but based on this first book, here's how I'm going to put it to give you some perspective with other series. It's way better than the Nick Carter Killmaster series. It's about one notch better than the Sam Durrell Assignment series by Edward S. Ahrens. It's slightly better than the Malco series, which I adore, by Gerard de Villiers. It's solidly better, way better than Don Smith's Secret Mission series, which I'm going to be doing an episode on in 2020. It's way, way better than the Baroness books by Paul Kenyon. It's also a good bit better than the John Gall series by Philip Attlee. And it's a little bit better, I think, than the Man from U.N.C.L.E. novels. It's not as good, though, as the first 10 Matt Helm books by Donald Hamilton. So we're talking a top-tier series here. I've only read the first couple James Bond books in the series, and I actually enjoyed those quite a bit. Comparing Modesty Blaze to James Bond's just kind of comparing apples and oranges to a certain extent. I'll tell you, I enjoyed the Modesty Blaze books more than I liked the James Bond books, but I understand that James Bond has a special place in people's hearts, and I did enjoy the first 2 books in the James Bond series. So that's Modesty Blaze, number 1 by Peter O'Donnell. There have been so many different editions of this book. You shouldn't have trouble finding it. I think it may actually still be in print on Amazon by Mysterious Press. So you shouldn't have trouble finding an affordable copy. But you should definitely read it if you're into spy fiction and adventure fiction. And it's a great origin story, whereas a lot of these series just kind of skip the origin story altogether.
Yeah, that's great. I've come across the name a lot, and I'm glad that you reviewed that because I was kind of curious about it as well. So it sounds like it's something worth pursuing. I think this episode is about middle of November. I think we always record just a little bit ahead, so I think we're middle of November. So we've got maybe what do you think, Tom? About four more episodes before we take a little bit of a hiatus.
Yeah, we'll get into it later, but we'll do 2 more episodes in November. We're going to do 2 episodes in December. Then we're going to go on hiatus for the last 2 weeks of December because you're all doing holiday stuff. And then we're going to come back roaring into action in January. We'll remind you of this when it happens, but if you're listening to these things out of order, and we do these episodes intentionally so they're evergreen, you can listen to them at any time, and that don't think we just disappeared and went away the last 2 weeks of December. We're just giving you time to get caught up.
Yeah, and of course we're going to do the obligatory year-end awards show as well, which will be a lot of fun.
Yes, the best of 2019, discussing our favorite books from 1950s, 60s, 70s in 2019.
Yeah, we also got to do the worst as well.
Yeah, we're gonna do a worst of the year, because I got a candidate for that. Raker by Don Scott.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to go with Brandon as the worst of the year, but who knows? I've still got some months left, so
yeah,
we'll see what happens. So I guess I'm the military fiction department of Paperback Warrior. So from my heart, I want to say Happy Veterans Day to all the veterans that are listening. We really appreciate all your support, and we try to cater to our audience that were vets. We really appreciate all the time that you put in. Tom, I'm sure you say the same thing.
Oh yeah,
as well.
definitely. I mean, just thank you for your service. We appreciate it. Your real life action inspired a lot of fictional action. That is the reason we live and breathe.
That's right. Well said. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening.
Be cool, guys.
Have a great week.